After a few hundred years of imperialism, major world superpowers have pretty much grabbed every bit of land that covers the Earth's surface. It's why France has more than a dozen overseas territories, the sun never sets on the British Empire, and America? Well, let's just not get into that. The mad dash to grab land is so crazy that in January, undersea volcanoes in the Pacific birthed a new island, and within days, it was claimed by nearby Tonga. And no, I'm not talking about some random island or that sliver of Antarctica that a random guy tried to unsuccessfully claim back in 2017. I'm talking about this 800 square mile or 2100 square kilometer area between Egypt and Sudan. And to understand why no one wants it, we're gonna have to go back to the past. At the end of the 20th century, Britain was expanding its empire across the globe. But obviously, they needed to divvy up this land of theirs to make it easier to administer. What was the best way to divvy it up? Look at the geographic features like rivers or mountains, send local teams to survey the religious, cultural, and demographic breakdown of the areas? Of course not. They basically just winged it. Just winging it seemed easiest. And since Britain controlled all the area anyways, did where the borders get placed really matter that much anyways? This right here is some Emmy award-winning foreshadowing. Well, skip forward 100 years and the empire lost basically all of the empire, and these crudely drawn borders started being a big problem. So much so that the only internationally recognized country to be formed in the last 30 years was the breakup of one former victim of inadequate map drawing into two to avoid a complete civil war. But another place these borders ended up being a problem was here, at the border between Egypt and Sudan. Wondering why I'm not showing the border? Well, that's because no one can seem to agree on where that border is. See, 100 plus years ago, Britain decided the border would be the 22nd parallel. Again, this border made about as much consideration for the local people as Putin gives for his political enemies. Absolutely none. But in this very specific circumstance, Britain decided to get smart, and a few years later decided to draw a new administrative boundary that put into consideration the use of the land by various tribes. That way, tribes wouldn't be living in one territory and grazing their cattle in another. You'd think the British taking the time to make decisions that actually benefited the people would turn out well. But if it's not obvious enough by my foreshadowing, it just made everything worse. Fast forward 114 years, and both territories are now fully fledged independent countries, no longer under British rule. The problem is, Sudan now recognizes the 1903 administrative border as the real border, while Egypt says the real border is that 1899 border on the 22nd parallel. What this means is that Bir Tawil is south of Egypt's border, so Egypt thinks it's part of Sudan, but it's also north of Sudan's border, so Sudan thinks it's part of Egypt. This doesn't really create many problems here, because there's a whopping 0 people living in Bir Tawil. There's not even any roads or buildings, it's just 800 square miles of nothing, ruled by nobody. So, if no one even lives here, why does either country care where the border is? Well, the border dispute does create an issue somewhere else. The Hala'ib Triangle is 10 times bigger than Bir Tawil, and instead of being claimed by no country, it's claimed by 2. That's because it's north of what Egypt thinks is the border, while simultaneously south of what Sudan says is the border. The two countries actually care about this piece of land, because they're actually things and people and places. Things and people and places. That's the kind of detail we get when we don't pay our scriptwriters enough. But look at that road, and sea access, and even 1,000 residents. Currently, the land is administered by Egypt, but who cares about a piece of land that's claimed by 2 countries? Let's get back to Bir Tawil. Despite guides like this on YouTube, Bir Tawil is the only place on the planet that is both habitable and unclaimed. The biggest overall unclaimed piece of land is the Mary Bird land on the Antarctic shelf, but that's not considered to be habitable land, since, it's the most isolated part of Antarctica. So unless you're looking to set up shop on a continent with average temperatures of negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 57 degrees Celsius, Bir Tawil is the only place on Earth where people might actually be able to create a new country. So, why don't people go establish the new independent nation of Asgardia? Well, scores of people have actually claimed the land, and it's become somewhat of a local tourist spot. But as of yet, no other country recognizes any of these claims. Probably because no one has done any of the typical things countries do, like set up paved roads, build bridges, and give corporations tax breaks. Typical government things. Instead, they mostly just pose for Instagram pics. The land may seem pretty unremarkable. After all, it's smaller than even tiny Rhode Island. It's still bigger than 28 internationally recognized countries. And if the Vatican, with a population less than the average high school, can be recognized as a country, the bar can't be that high. While the land is technically habitable, it's still a desert, and there are no roads leading into the areas to support a city. To make matters even worse for your hopes of being the king of your own nation, there aren't really any natural resources to keep a self-sustaining economy, so getting off the ground will definitely be an uphill battle. But Bir Tawil isn't the only strange quirk of British colonialism. If you like this video, check out this one on why the sun has never set on the British Empire. And remember, there's always more to learn.